Arepas are one of the most beloved dishes in Venezuela. They're endlessly versatile and deeply personal, served breakfast, lunch, or dinner, and filled with whatever your soul craves. But what happens when even this beloved staple vanishes from the table? In Venezuela, a brutal economic collapse turned arepas into a luxury and cash into worthless paper. Come join me to learn what happened. Arepas are popular across Central and South America. They are a type of ground maize flatbread and can be filled with anything from black beans and plantains to cheese and beef, popular both as street food and at home. Today, I'm making one of my favorites, Reina Pepiada, a creamy mix of avocado and shredded chicken that is ubiquitous in Venezuela. The recipe is straightforward, but illustrates how basic necessities became hard to access during the crisis. First, let's explain hyperinflation. Inflation is when prices rise. A little inflation, say 2% a year, is considered healthy. That is on average what we see here in the US, where I live. But hyperinflation, that's when prices rise rapidly, typically defined as over 50% a month, every month. Mechanically, hyperinflation is the result of a rapid increase in the money supply, almost always caused by government printing of money to pay for spending that it could not afford otherwise. Breaking this down further, money supply just means money in circulation, or money in people's pockets and saved in their bank accounts. When the government prints money, that money is created, paid to someone, and added to the stock of money available in the economy for use. As more money chases fewer goods, the price of goods rise. Hyperinflation is rare, but when it hits, it can be devastating. Germany in the 1920s, Zimbabwe in the 2000s, and Venezuela in the 2010s, where inflation wasn't just 50% a month, it reached over 300,000% in February of 2019. Venezuela's crisis reflects an epic story of mismanagement. First, Venezuela has tremendous oil wealth. It holds about 18% of all known oil reserves, the largest stock of any country in the world. Oil production peaked in 1998 at 3.4 million barrels per day, the same year that Hugo Chavez won the Venezuelan presidency. However, this production fell over time due to underinvestment, declining know-how, and US sanctions. Foreign companies were unwilling to invest due to unfriendly contract terms and expropriation of private assets by the government. The state-owned oil company, PDVSA, was hollowed out of experienced professionals and filled with unqualified loyalists. Finally, US sanctions for human rights abuses impacted Venezuela's ability to access financing and export its oil. Over time, however, Venezuela had become entirely dependent on oil revenues, which accounted for about 95% of its exports and 75% of government revenue. When oil prices were high and barrels were flowing out of the fields, the government used those large revenues to fund generous social programs, education, housing, and food subsidies. They did successfully improve living standards for a time, and the poverty rate fell from 42% in 1999 to 27% in 2013. However, the gains proved to be temporary and dependent on continued oil revenue to finance. At the same time, Chavez filled the government with his cronies and corruption ran rampant, with an estimated $11 billion stolen from PDVSA between 2004 and 2014. While production declined gradually over time, the collapse of oil prices in 2014 was the last straw. Over a short period, Venezuela's revenue fell by over 50%. But rather than cut spending or reform its economy, the government printed money to cover the shortfall, hoping that oil prices would recover. Officials also implemented price and capital controls that made conditions more difficult. Businesses couldn't import basic ingredients, and shortages became routine. Hyperinflation devastated the lives of everyday Venezuelans and made previously abundant items like the ingredients in arepas difficult to access. In the case of food, the government fixed prices for many basics in a misguided effort to keep things affordable. But these prices were fixed below the cost of production, meaning, for example, a chicken farmer spent more on feed and equipment than they could sell their chickens for. As a result, many producers stopped producing, which combined with sky-high import prices resulted in shortages and even worse price increases on the black market. Imported goods, such as the vegetable oils that go into mayonnaise, also became much more expensive as the bolivar became increasingly less valuable than foreign currencies. By 2018, 90% of Venezuelans said they did not have enough money for food. More than half had lost over 20 pounds, which became termed the Maduro diet, named after Maduro, the successor to Chavez. Infant and maternal mortality increased as there were severe shortages of medicines and hospitals lacked electricity and running water to operate effectively. As conditions worsened, an estimated 7.8 million people left Venezuela, fleeing to neighboring countries for a better life. It is important to note that the costs of hyperinflation are ultimately borne by the poorest. Price increases of staples and critical items are often the most painful, as people cannot simply go without. A shortage of corn flour, toilet paper, and antibiotics impacts society much more severely than a shortage of luxury cars. Additionally, lower-income households that live paycheck to paycheck typically do not have investments to cushion the impact of hyperinflation, as assets such as housing and gold hold their real value much more effectively than cash. The wealthy are also much more likely to have assets abroad, in US dollars and foreign equities, which are not impacted by domestic price levels. Although hyperinflation benefits few, its negative effects are disproportionately distributed to those that are least well equipped to handle them. While tragic, why is this important to learn about? Venezuela serves as a warning story that even the most blessed countries can be brought down by poor governance. Any country, no matter how safe it appears, is susceptible. It was only a few decades prior, in 1970, that Venezuela was the richest country in Latin America and a top 20 economy in the world, ahead of places like Spain and Israel. Although on the surface, the mismanagement of oil resources and poor economic policy seem like the culprits of the crisis, there is an underlying root cause that led to these outcomes. That root cause was the deterioration of institutions. Institutions are critical in shaping the distribution of power and ensuring the enforcement of rules. Independence of the legislature, the courts, the central bank, and the media serve as important checks to prevent abuses of authority, even though they don't dictate the specific policies that emerge. In other words, institutions form the structure that all political actors make decisions within, similar to how arepas form a base to hold the filling, which can change depending on people's specific preferences. Although Chavez was democratically elected, he soon used his popularity to aggregate power and erode those checks. This included writing a new constitution in 1998, which lengthened presidential terms and abolished the Senate to create a unicameral legislature. He purged civilian and military leadership that opposed him, including firing over 18,000 employees of PDVSA. Chavez also broke down the independence of the judiciary and clamped down on media freedom, criminalizing dissent. By the end of his rule, the military, the courts, the media, and the state-owned company were all under his control. This nearly unchecked power led to unchecked corruption, which benefited a few at the expense of many. Food for thought. Venezuela's story can be interpreted as a tragedy created by a small group of corrupt and self-interested individuals. And while that is certainly true, it is also important to recognize that Chavez was democratically elected and genuinely supported by millions. Both the elite who benefited from the corruption and everyday Venezuelans who were supported by the social programs chose to turn a blind eye to theft and concentration of power, until it was too late. The deeper lesson for politicians may be that seemingly small compromises for political or personal gains can unleash irreversible forces, until a result that was once unimaginable becomes reality. And it is a lesson for all of us, as voters and as citizens, that institutions matter, even when we can sometimes be frustrated with their results. Venezuela's tragedy reminds us that when structure breaks down, when we erode institutions for short-term gains, we risk losing far more than we imagined. Strong institutions, like a good arepa, holds everything together. What do you see as the most important institutions in your country? Or has anyone lived through hyperinflation? I'd love to hear your story in the comments. If you like your economics with a side of avocado, please hit subscribe. Thanks for nomming on some economics with me. I'll see you next time.